We have on offer our last presenter for the risk reduction, our last presenter for the risk reduction panel, and then we'll have discussant and moderator. So without ado, I would like to introduce my friend and colleague Aparna Tandon, Coordinator, International Program on Disaster Risk Management and Project Specialist at ICCROM, and I'll let her tell you what that means. Aparna?
Thank you, Corey. I'm honored to be here today. And ICCROM stands for those of you who do not know, stands for International Center for the Study of Preservation and the Restoration of Cultural Property, and it is based in Rome. It's an IGO, an intergovernmental organization with 134 member states. Okay, so just to get started, I know I had to do something here. F5, yes. Okay. What you see on the screen is the image from Aceh, Banda Aceh in Indonesia, after the Indian Ocean tsunami. This was a disaster that caused destruction and devastation across 14 countries. And expressing hope for the large recovery effort that followed in the wake of this disaster, President Clinton, and I quote, said, "We need to make sure that this recovery process accomplishes more than just restoring what was there before." And this idea of his got encapsulated in, there was something wrong with my animation there, into a phrase called Build Back Better. And since then, Build Back Better has turned into a widely advocated guiding principle for sustainable post-disaster recovery. The motivation behind this principle is easy to understand. Who wouldn't like to invest in building communities that are less vulnerable and can withstand disasters? Yet, in actual practice, its application remains challenging. What's better? What does better look like? For whom? How? Where? Questions such as these have led to a growing body of knowledge around the implementation of this practice within the field of humanitarian assistance. However, my paper focuses on an under-recognized and until now underexplored aspect of Build Back Better, and that is culture. I would like to argue if resilience and sustainable development are the end goals of any sustainable post-disaster recovery, then culture, which is the enabler of both, should be a core component of post-disaster recovery programs. But before I go further, I would like to clarify which culture I'm talking about. Culture is an inherently complex concept, as Terry Cannon has just pointed out in his speech, in his opening, very remarkable talk. And therefore, it is hard to define. A study carried way back in 1952 had pointed out that there were 164 definitions of culture until that time. It seems that different usages have given a different meaning to this term. For example, the World Disaster Report on Risk and Culture, mentioned by my esteemed colleague Terry, chose to define it as beliefs, attitudes, values, and their associated behaviors that are shared by a significant number of people in hazard-affected places. But culture is more than that. It is also, as UNESCO terms it, a transformational force that has several physical and non-physical manifestations, which include oral traditions, knowledge systems, performing arts, crafts, monuments, artifacts, manuscripts, and so on. And it is this definition of culture that has been accepted in most of the UN policy documents relating to disaster risk management. Using this definition, I would like to highlight the aspects of culture that are crucial for the implementation of Build Back Better principle. Traditional knowledge held by communities that live off the land or are living in hazardous areas can make significant contribution to the reduction of the impacts of disasters and save lives. During the Category 5 cyclone Pam, which hit Vanuatu just this year in March 2015, people used traditional storm shelters, and you can see a partially constructed storm shelter here, that helped to save their lives. And there are plenty of such examples that we can cite from where traditional knowledge has helped to save people's lives in disasters. However, failure to use this knowledge during the processes of recovery and reconstruction can lead to increased vulnerability. As has also been observed in my own country, India, in the Marathwada region, where instead of being owner-driven, the post-earthquake reconstruction processes were very much donor-driven. Moreover, reconstruction and relocation did not take into consideration aspects such as rural lifestyles, the affected local climate, the traditional building materials, or the use of living spaces. As a result, the affected villages made unsafe adaptations to their new homes, and having moved far away from their farms, many of them became landless or lost their livelihoods. And at the same time, those traditional houses and temples that could have been simply repaired or retrofitted were torn down. And here on the screen, you can see the example, and this is an actual example. This is the family which owned this traditional house. It was stone house, and it could have been very nicely retrofitted, but they were convinced to move into this ramshackle, tin roof building, which is not even conducive to the local climate, and it thereby increased their vulnerability to other hazards. So this is the impact if you do not take traditional knowledge into consideration. Religion. Religion also has a role to play. Religion and shared belief systems can be a source of resilience. And here, I would like to give the strong example of Laku, and I hope also I'm pronouncing it well. Laku is a traditional system of extended families and land sharing in Haiti, and it evolved as a defense mechanism against plantation culture and plantation owners. And there is an intense discussion going on in aid circles that had the reconstruction process in Haiti taken into consideration. Laku, the story of housing and land reform in Haiti would have been completely different. And this system could have helped to build a more resilient Haiti where people's agency could have been increased by taking this system into consideration. And our colleague from Haiti is here, also John Junior. He'll be able to shed more light on it because as an architect, he has experienced it and he has been working with this system. So maybe he can later on add something more to it. I have just read about it. I'm not an architect. For deeply religious societies that live in hazardous areas, religion can also be a vital source of knowledge for disaster risk reduction. For example, in Ladakh, which is from my region in my native state in Jammu and Kashmir, and it's a mountain desert where there is no possibility of life surviving, but still people have survived. These Buddhist structures, which are like Chortans, Rigzim, Nombo, and these Mane walls, they are very familiar sites because they remind people of past catastrophes. And actually, it's a source of vital knowledge because most of these are, as a reminder, like villagers are cautioned not to build amidst floodplains. And this is a very kind of a big source for their people to survive, and life has survived there for many years. And it's only now, with modern construction, that we are making Leh more vulnerable to disaster, the city, the capital of Ladakh. Nobody can deny culture, that culture is an enabler of development. We've had lots of research done of what role culture can play in promoting tourism and jobs. But in most countries, it is still a largely informal sector. But at the same time, it is also a vital and important source of livelihoods. For example, the flower sellers outside temples in Nepal were back within 1 month, ready to sell flowers and expose themselves to dangers, sitting amidst rubble and still the debris of the temple. We were there 1 month after. It was a very dangerous situation to be there, but still they were willing to come there. But the post-disaster needs assessment that was carried out by Nepal Planning Commission did not take these flower sellers or their livelihoods into consideration. In fact, they estimated the physical damage to cultural heritage to be around $169 million and the net loss of income at about 10% of that, that is $17 million. And let alone these flower sellers, this does not even cover the losses and damages to the museum sector, libraries, fine art galleries, music industry, associated arts and craft industries. So this is like really, really an amount which is an underestimation of what will be needed to not only restore the physical losses, but also physical damage, but also to build a stronger and more rejuvenated culture sector. For example, if in addition to the restoration of physical damage, we had to implement Build Back Better for the marginalized museum sector, it may involve retrofitting of the buildings, upgradation of storage and exhibition spaces, training of the staff, and developing some public outreach programs. But where are the resources? And where are the institutions that will support this process? Culture also plays an important role in bridging communal divides. And I know this personally because I'm from Jammu and Kashmir, and I have lived this for 15 years of my life as a conservator. It is also very important in promoting inclusive processes of dialogue. Baitur Rahman Grand Mosque in Aceh, which you see here in the picture, provided relief to many people after the tsunami. It provided refuge to people who were made homeless. And it became a symbol of survival because at first it had withstood a war and then a tsunami. Nonetheless, aid agencies as well as cultural agencies that had been advocating the principle of building back better at that time hesitated from providing assistance to save this mosque in the name of neutrality. Because I would like to point out that at that time, Aceh was also going through a conflict, a violent conflict. This could have been a huge opportunity to win people's trust in a society that was fragmented by a prolonged conflict. But people's wishes were overlooked. So again, we have to consider what aspects of culture we have to save, and sometimes it can be a win-win for humanitarian aid agencies to consider culture in their programming. The first part of my presentation focused on how culture could be important or crucial for Build Back Better. The second part is now going to focus on strategies that are needed to incorporate culture into DRM programs and enhancing national responses. This is because despite having been mentioned in key documents, such as the recently released Sendai framework of UNISDR that set the global agenda for disaster risk reduction, culture's incorporation in DRM programming remains ad hoc and fragmented. Part of the problem arises from the complex nature of culture, highly context-specific nature of culture, and also because of its multiple interactions with development as well as with disaster risk, as also pointed out by Terry. But the other part of the problem comes from the very much somewhat insular approach to disaster risk management that the culture sector itself has. And I'm sorry, I'm going to be a little critical about how our sector has approached disaster risk management until now. And these strategies that I'm proposing are based on my own experience of having assessed damage to cultural heritage in the aftermath of earthquake in Kashmir in 2005, in Haiti in 2010, in Philippines in 2013, and now recently in Nepal in 2015. All four disaster situations, all four places had pre-existing conditions of weak governance, development challenges, deep-rooted corruption also, and conflict. And they were highly complex situations, and the damage to culture was extensive, large. Okay. So the first thing that, and I think it was brought out previously also, is the lack of baseline information. We haven't done, as a sector, we haven't done our homework. We don't even know what are the intangible heritage elements. When I was in Philippines, we were at that time trying to understand where are the inventories, what could be the intangible losses. And so it's like really in a chaos situation. We do not have geo-referenced information on cultural assets, associated economies, and we also haven't done asset-specific I'm deliberately using this term asset because I think it encompasses both tangible and intangible elements. Asset-specific pre- and post-disaster risk assessments. And when I say risk assessments, in museums, risk assessment means completely different thing, and in the world of sites and heritage, built heritage, it means something totally different thing. So we also need to, unify ourselves and try to standardize the system of risk assessments and understand and develop a common understanding of what are risks, what are hazards, and what are vulnerabilities. This would help us to mount quick responses as well as reduce risks to cultural heritage. The second thing is, and I'm not going to laugh at this because there is a UN system of relief and recovery in 2005 came up with this system or architecture where they got groupings of UN and non-UN organizations, IGOs and NGOs, together around a service that is provided during a humanitarian crisis. For example, food, water, shelter, and they're called clusters. So there's a food cluster, there's a shelter cluster, and in this one, there is no cluster for culture. We are like gender. We are everywhere, but nowhere. So we need to have a culture cluster, and I feel strongly for it. That's why I'm making a point. Okay. So, and just because we are not in the cluster system, we are also out of the assessments that are done. So there is a first assessment that is done within 72 hours, which is called multi-sector initial rapid assessment. I'm sorry, it's quite a mouthful. It is carried out within first 72 hours, and it's based on it's done mainly on the baseline information, and in this, culture is not included. What happens out of this MIRA is that there is a flash appeal. The outcome is There's an emergency appeal for funds, and the funds are released, and culture is out of it. And that means we have to fend for ourselves. Then there is the PDNA, Post-Disaster Needs Assessment, which is done after the relief phase is formally over. Well, good news is that we are part of PDNA, and this is thanks to UNESCO's efforts. But, as I pointed out in the case of Nepal, operationalizing PDNA has been a big problem, partly because we all ourselves do not know what is at stake. So we need to do our homework, and we need to get people trained into PDNA to be able to make use of this common framework, because this is what UNDP and the World Bank are pushing governments to go into, and they want to unify, they want to streamline, and they want to reduce corruption. I'm not saying that these systems are exemplary, they are working very well, they have their own problems, but we cannot remain on the periphery and then cry, help, 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 but help with what, right? Surge capacity, that's another thing. We've just discussed, we had wonderful and excellent presentation from Laurie Foley, wonderful work that you're doing, it's really exemplary. But in a complex disaster situation, we need to have the ability to rapidly deploy experienced personnel, where an experienced and professional people who are able to deal with an unfolding complex emergency. And often UN relief and recovery system relies on, lately they have been relying on militaries, on national armies. And in Nepal also we saw that, where choppers are deployed, hospitals, doctors, everything is, communication systems, and we have to develop that kind of surge capacity. In fact, in Haiti, in order to do some salvage, some basic salvage in a school at the Center of Contemporary Art, we had to seek the help of, we had to go to the office of the UN peacekeepers and get their help to come up with their heavy machinery to remove some of the rubble and help us to go through and salvage artifacts. And without their help, we wouldn't have been able to do so, because to carry 500 masks to Haiti, I had to pay extra, effort. So imagine, we don't have planes, we don't have excess supplies, and we want to be an actor. So how are we going to do this? So one possible, and there's Corey there, one possible solution would be to train the military, because military in Nepal was, like, for example, already helping to clear debris around cultural sites. They were helping with evacuation. So that's Corey there, giving a short training to the military in Nepal while we were there. And so we should do this more often. The other possible way is to prepare national teams, like you are already doing here in USA, and we have a very effective model that ICCROM has developed, which is the first aid courses, where we develop national teams, and we let the leadership, we let the team own their own situations, and Prince Claus Fund, the Cultural Emergency Response Fund of Prince Claus Fund, gives them seed grants to replicate training at home and prepare their teams. And this, by the way, is one of our very successful first aiders, Abdul Hamid Saleh, who was able to respond to the bombing at the Islamic Museum in Cairo. Cash for work programs for culture. And when I was in Philippines, I saw these, like virtually places like this. 26 churches had been reduced to rubble, and it was like a double whammy. First an earthquake, then a typhoon. And the National Museum had 8 staff, 8 people, who were in charge of this emergency, because they only had that many people. And they didn't have the money to hire extra labor. And at that time, UNDP was running cash for work programs. So it was one of our suggestions that maybe UNDP should, we should work with them to develop more cash for work programs and have, extra labor to clear debris around cultural sites. So interlocking cultural first aid with humanitarian assistance is a very, very important strategic orientation to take, and we should try to do that. And I see I'm running out of my time, so I'll go very quickly. We have to organize, and also like in Nepal, we organize a training for masons, architects, and craftspeople to stabilize buildings. And then I read in a newspaper that USAID had trained 1,800 people, 1,800 masons recently for retrofitting the buildings. So we could have done a joint training, first for response and then linking response with recovery. But again, you see, the insular approach, we work in our sector, they work in their sector, so there's no communication. The second, the fourth strategy that I would like to propose is to support community-centered initiatives, because communities are the first one to respond in a disaster situation. And here I'm giving the example of Heritage Foundation of Pakistan. There are many community-centered organizations that are doing wonderful post-disaster recovery work, but we need to link up with them and we need to support their initiatives. I don't have the time to explain what work they're doing, so maybe we'll keep it up for question and answer session. The fifth strategy that I would like to propose is that we need to develop an interagency standing coordination mechanism, just like the one that exists in humanitarian sector, because this would help us to develop a common funding, an emergency fund, because they also have an emergency fund with which they do surge, basically they deploy people, and we also need something like that. And recently we had a kind of an experiment where we worked with Smithsonian Institution, ICCROM, ICCROM, and some other universities, and we were funded by Prince Claus Fund, partly funded by Prince Claus Fund, to do a damage assessment and then later on do some work. And such an arrangement is very much needed, where trust, mutual trust, understanding core competencies of the participating institutions should be the criteria for developing this kind of mechanism. We have this kind of mechanism in form of Blue Shield, but Blue Shield is a beleaguered movement today because there is no political will to make this mechanism work. So this is, again, some soul searching needed here. Do we have the guts? Do we have the will to make it happen? Last but not the least, we have to support applied research, and that means field projects, retrospective studies, doing seminars like this, and making a stronger partnership with universities, having more Terry Cannons to come and inspire us, challenge us, having Yale University, having UPenn University, having other universities all around the world working with us. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. Last words I want to say is that culture has a role to play in post-disaster recovery, whether as a relic, whether as a monument, whether as a symbol, but our own capacity to protect culture is minimal, so the only way to go forward is to work closely with the humanitarians and merge with them, work with them. Thank you. And I have the pleasure of inviting my discussant, Katharyn Hanson.
Aparna, do you want to sit? Do you want to stand? I will stand. Okay. You can help me read my illegible handwriting up here. So, first of all, thank you to the organizers. Thank you to Aparna. Where are you? It is an honor to have been asked to be the discussant for your paper, because one of the first things I've really ever thought about cultural heritage has been through you. It has been quite an inspiration to learn from your work.
I bribed her to say that.
Yeah. And I was going to also make a special thank you to Corey and to Brian for asking me to be the discussant on this paper, because I guess I needed a dose of optimism. I am really very optimistic after having read Aparna's paper and having spent a really lovely couple of hours in the train together yesterday. And I think one of the reasons why I'm really optimistic is because we had the opportunity to talk a little bit about the different narratives that are taking place in cultural heritage right now. I do most of my work in Iraq. I'm a Mesopotamian archaeologist. My area of specialty is Syria and Iraq. And I see a lot of what Aparna's talking about through that lens. And I'll be honest, that lens is pretty depressing. And we really get focused in this idea of loss. And so Aparna and I have been speaking a bit yesterday, and I think we'll keep speaking a bit, about this narrative of resilience versus a narrative of loss. That there is something that you can do, that it's rebuilding, it's resilience, it's taking action on the ground and doing things, as opposed to simply looking at what has been lost and bemoaning that. And so I really wanted to thank her for framing this under the Build It Back Better framework that she structured her talk with. I think that as a phrase is something that is really good for us to take to heart. And I also appreciate the fact that it isn't just about building back better afterwards, but it's about taking action at the time too, doing what you can on the ground. And I think that's one of the things that, especially with Syria and Iraq, I'm at the University of Pennsylvania. We're part of a consortium on a project called Shoshi, which you'll hear about later from my colleague Salam Al-Kuntar. And in this, one of the things that we're really working towards is trying to take action now, that it doesn't make sense to wait for the conflict to be over in Syria. It doesn't make sense to wait for ISIS to leave Mosul. That doesn't make sense. That we have to be able to take action now, be that documentation projects, mean that simply facilitating assistance and research for colleagues on the ground, or getting actual supplies to colleagues on the ground. So a big thank you for optimism there. And this idea that we do need to begin as soon as the humanitarian response begins, that we need to frame the way we're thinking about these problems in that way. The second thing I wanted to highlight in Aparna's talk was her focus on definitions. Terminology is important. And I think that for what we do when we're thinking about cultural heritage and risk management and working together, that cultural heritage is in no way a hindrance to risk management, but that when used right, it really facilitates protection. And we saw some great examples of traditional knowledge being used to build more protective and stable situations for sites that are at risk. And I think that with the traditional knowledge we're looking at, Aparna rightly pointed out that this is something that can be taken and is an important motivation for looking to local communities and to be in discussion with stakeholders. As Stephen pointed out in the discussion section for our first paper, stakeholders are really crucial to projects going forward and for them to be successful. I can think of, for instance, water use and regulation in southern Iraq and dealing with arid zones and seasonalness. We've just been talking quite a bit about climate change and the importance of that traditional knowledge getting roped into that. And that kind of brings me to this idea that I thought created a nice basis for what Aparna was saying, which is this people-first concept, really focusing on the individuals who are there. And they are the ones who will be dictating what is protected, what is prioritized, and that knowing that cultural heritage landscape can facilitate better humanitarian response, and that actors, any actors in a crisis, can do better work with having a knowledge of what the cultural landscape looks like that they're acting in. And we've seen this in northern Iraq. There's a rather conflict violent example I'm thinking of right off the bat of Sinjar Mountain, and a colleague who was up there on the front lines when the Peshmerga, the Kurdish military forces, and the local Yazidi forces were fighting together. And he tells a story that I thought was very powerful because it talked about the importance of a heritage site in a conflict zone and actors needing to know cultural landscape for that. And that was that rather than taking the high ground, the military strategic ground, the Kurdish forces who were working in tandem with the Yazidi forces pulled back and fought from the Yazidi shrines when they were losing ground. That they moved to the cultural site of importance for the local community to fight from that because they knew that was going to be the flashpoint, that that's where ISIS would take over and destroy first. And I think that that is, for me, a really telling example of this importance of actors needing to know what the cultural landscape is. And then finally, I wanted to talk a bit about the power of cultural heritage. And Aparna showed some really fantastic examples of cultural heritage bringing folks together. We'll hear, I think tomorrow, Friday, from Jessie Johnson, who's a colleague of mine who's worked at the Iraqi Institute with me. And she's been working there since 2009 and can speak quite a bit to this ability to bring diverse groups who have been separated by years of conflict together to make a group, a network of experts who can work to facilitate protection and management down the road. And finally, the last thing I'm going to say, because I think we're short on time, aren't we, is that I'm a little bit humbled by Aparna's last section of her paper, because that really is a call to action. And we are being asked to interact with, to talk to think about the terminology for the humanitarian community. And I have to admit that for my research and my area of expertise, that is something that we don't do enough of. We do get in this isolationist idea where culture and cultural heritage sites, they're so important that we don't consider a way to bring them in into what we're doing with the larger humanitarian structure. So I wanted to thank you for that. I'm also going to ask you what my first step should be in reaching out to that humanitarian community, because it's all well and good to call us out for action, but what do I do next, Aparna? And I think with that, we're going to open it up for discussion.
Okay, so may I have questions, please? Yes.
Eric Porsche from the Foundation of the American Institute for Conservation. Really appreciated your call for baseline data. As somebody who writes a lot of grants, I'm always looking for that needs statement. And when we get to disaster preparation, response, we don't have much good data. It's very hard to say, if we do this training, it will save something, and give a number to that. So I guess my impossible question in part is, how do we do that? And also I noticed that some of the information presented here and in the previous talks gave dollar amounts primarily about the built environment.
Not about the...
But even there, I mean, if the White House burns down, there's probably an insurance replacement value. You can get the same square footage rebuilt, but it's not the same monument, and let alone Abraham Lincoln's hat down the hall here.
Yeah.
So how do we make that case, and how do we fit in with the rest of the disaster response,
Yes.
emergency response community?
Okay, I thank you. I can only share my insights, and like you, I'm also from the movable heritage world, and where I had to confront this fact, that in fact, the built heritage people are better prepared because their scale is big, and the first thing to fall down in a hazard is a building. You know, it's the first line of defense, and they also have to deal a lot with urban planners and other outside actors. So it's just by the nature of the way they work, they are more, the risk assessment, for example, in that field is much more consistent, the terminology. We often mix in our museum world, we mix response with recovery, with preparedness, with mitigation. We have really, I mean, if you just look at the past guidelines, I've done a 10-year review for ICCROM when I had to write a position paper, with the help of some interns, and we were really amazed to see there is so much mishmash of terminology that first we need to get around to that, and that's where AIC has a role to play. That's one thing. About the baseline information, I think it's a country-specific baseline information that we need. So what needs to happen is that at the, we need more Lori Follies who work with the FEMA, national departments, to generate, and also culture ministries, to make big maps, up-to-date maps. Where is the cultural asset? So Smithsonian has 20 museums. Where are the 20 museums? And what these 20 museums have in them. Then the second thing, which as an emergency responder is very important, is this prioritization. It was brought up earlier by Anne in her, we don't do risk assessment, so how will we make priorities? If we had done risk assessment, I would be able to say, I was able to, I'm sorry, I was in the Suitland, the pods, where I saw the huge storage. It's a huge risk. You have 5 million objects there, and it's on a marshy ground, and you need to understand, I'm not pointing fingers, it's everywhere, the same situation. 90% of the stuff is in storage, it's badly defined, it doesn't have inventory, and we do not have floor plans to say where is it. So if the military is going to go, like what we saw in Nepal, the military was going in the endangered buildings that were still standing because museum workers are not allowed. And how will they find things? So what is needed? Georeference data, floor plans, it's homework. It's down and dirty work. We have to do it, roll up our sleeves and do it. There's no other way. I don't see any other way. I think we should not even ask for public funding if we can't do this, right?
We have time for just a couple more. I'm sorry, we're running a little bit over.
Mine's quick. I'm Aviva Rosenthal from the Office of International Relations here. Just based on what you just said, in terms of the homework, how much is new technologies like 3D digitization playing into leapfrogging the maps and the old homework and actually digitizing whole structures for the future?
There are, the complex emergencies that I have been, their digital technologies have failed, but that's because of the backlog and also of the inability of the home institutions to keep up with the pace with the digital storage and other issues. And also Hurricane Sandy, if you may recall, was the digital disaster, which was a more bigger digital disaster because we don't do mirroring, we don't put data, we want to keep our data to ourselves, we have PCs everywhere, so we don't do even good digital preservation. So rather than doing high-tech technology, I think what is needed is an amalgam of both. Key into national systems where you have such large servers, where some baseline information about where is it and what is it is kept and backed up, and then really develop some emergency systems where you also have paper-based inventories and in multiple locations and things like that, because there's no other way to it. I have heard requests from Canada sometimes, like in every disaster, invariably electricity fails, or the computer system shuts down. So if you haven't done a mirror site, if you haven't put something on the cloud, which you are not likely to put on the cloud because of the security issues, so either invest in those kinds of mechanisms or do the basic work better and get rid of the backlogs. The backlogs are the problem.
Hi, my name is Deidre McCarthy. I'm with the Cultural Resource GIS facility of the National Park Service. And it's more of a comment than a question. But I would say to your question, the state of the technology is growing and getting better. And I think there are ways to put stuff on the cloud. There are ways to not necessarily mirror sites, but to put your data in multiple locations. And it's a growing problem. Yes, but it is something that is resolvable, and it is something that will require us as cultural resource professionals to start actually collaborating with each other. In the United States, the state of historic preservation is very distributed between all of the states and the tribes and the local governments and federal agencies in terms of maintaining inventories. The inventory, I would agree, is absolutely critical, and it doesn't matter if it's built or intangible or whatever, we need to have those inventories, and I think the state of the technology will only improve and enable us to reach that goal much faster. And I'll just plug that tomorrow morning I'll be talking about Katrina and this very issue, so hopefully we'll get to that.
Looking forward to that.